Okay, good afternoon. So today we're going to be looking at William Blake's poem London, and as usual I'm going to be talking you through the different methods that Blake uses and how he uses those methods to communicate his ideas, in this case about the oppressive nature of city life and the abusive powers that are at work within the City of London. So, as usual, I'm just going to start with a little bit of AO3, and my argument that I'm going to be discussing in this video is that Blake uses London as a vehicle, as a tool, as a way to explore his ideas about the oppressive nature of city life, and furthermore to critique humankind's failure to build a society that's based not on greed, not on oppression, but on more universal values of love and joy and freedom. Blake, like Shelley and like Wordsworth, other poets whose works you've studied within this collection, is a romantic poet. And it's really worth noting that at the time that he was writing this poem, the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom was in full swing. Now, Blake really opposed the Industrial Revolution in a lot of ways. He felt that it was atomising society, cutting people off from the natural world, and leading people to forget what it was that truly made them human. And I think that these ideas come through very strongly within this poem, which also deals with the way in which life in the City of London is becoming increasingly controlled, increasingly regulated, and therefore increasingly lacking in the sorts of freedoms that he longs for. So, to touch briefly upon the structure of this poem is written in 4 quatrains, which are 4-line stanzas and which are usually rhyming. And the reason that this is particularly interesting is because this tight, rigid structure, which also makes use of a lot of repetition, is used to reflect the rigidity and inflexibility of life in the City of London. So that is what this structure is being used to convey, that sense of rigidity and oppression, that lack of freedom. So unlike in some of the other poems from within the collection that you would have studied, which make extensive use of enjambment and which have more kind of loose and open sorts of structures, this poem is really quite rigid, and that sense of constraint can be felt all the way through. So let's have a look then at stanza 1. Now, Blake sets out his ideas really clearly from the first stanza, in which we're introduced to a persona who's walking through the streets of London. The poem is told from the first person perspective, so we might infer from that this is Blake's own perspective and reflective of some of the experiences that he's had within the city. So the first verb within the poem, wander, creates a sense of aimlessness and perhaps spontaneity. But it also conveys a sense of individual personal liberty, personal freedom on the part of the persona, which really contrasts with the ways in which the other people within the poem are presented. And this creates an interesting perspective from the start of the poem. We see London through Blake's eyes, and as he comments on the other people that he encounters or that he hears throughout the city, we perhaps get the impression that he views himself perhaps slightly differently to those people. He's a slightly removed observer of the oppressive nature of city life. And we might perhaps make an inference that Blake, as he was quite a visionary character, quite a progressive thinker, quite out of step in many ways with the times in which he was living, we might infer that he doesn't feel himself as intellectually restricted as some of the other people that he encounters. We'll touch again on that later. So, I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. So this word chartered has connotations of ownership and of control and of restriction. So these are some of the ideas that this word brings to mind. It connotes ownership, control, and restriction. And that sense of ownership and control and restriction is also echoed by Blake's use of repetition, which creates, as again we spoke about at the start, that sense of rigidity, that sense of inflexibility. Each street is chartered, and even the Thames, the river that runs through the heart of the city, is controlled, is chartered, as though its course has been plotted by the authorities. So I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. And we have the use of juxtaposition here between chartered and flow. And it's as though nature is perhaps in conflict with the restrictions that are being placed upon it by authority. Whereas chartered has connotations of ownership and control, flow has connotations of freedom. And this use of juxtaposition creates that sense of conflict between the natural world, represented by the river, represented by the Thames, and the restrictive authorities who control the city. So we get a sense of Blake's perspective on this really early on. We get that feeling that he's frustrated and angered by the restrictive nature of life in the city of London. So, line 3. And mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. And there's that repetition again. But here, mark has different meanings in these two different lines. The first meaning of mark here is notice. So he notices in every face that he encounters, every face that he comes across, marks of weakness, marks of woe. And here, this word marks means signs. So he sees and he notices in the faces of the people that he passes signs of weakness and signs of woe. And the use of that alliterative W there connects these concepts. The weakness of the people makes them feel woe, which means misery and sadness. So marks of weakness, marks of woe. This is his impression of the people that live in his city, that they are weak, that their power has been stripped from them, and that they are subjugated, they are oppressed by those who are in power, and this makes them feel miserable. So again, if you're going to comment on the alliteration there, let's make it a useful comment on alliteration. The alliteration is used to link the concepts of weakness and woe. Essentially saying that one leads to the other. Having a lack of freedom makes you miserable. And this is Blake's entire concept here, that the restrictive nature of city life leads to the misery and the wretchedness of the people within it. So let's just have a look at some of those methods that we've picked out. We've noticed that the poem's written in 4 quatrains, and the use of those quatrains is these rhyming 4-line stanzas to create a sense of rigidity and oppression. We've looked at some of the connotations of these words. We've identified the method of repetition, juxtaposition and alliteration already. Okay, let's continue. In these next 3 lines, we have the use of anaphora, this repetition at the start of successive lines in every. And let's just have a look at what Blake is hearing. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Now we're going to look at in some depth at that line about the mind-forged manacles, as it's one of the most vital in the poem. But this use of anaphora is really, really revealing as well. This use of anaphora, this use of repetition, suggests that in every sound every man makes, every cry he makes, every child's cry, in every voice, in every ban, he hears this lack of freedom. And that use of anaphora creates a sense of the universality, the universal nature of suffering. Everyone in the city feels that misery, from every man to every infant, to every single voice. There isn't a person within the City of London that isn't affected by the suffering that has been brought about by their weakness and by their woe. Their lack of freedom leads to this universal sense of misery and pain. Okay, and this is what Blake is hearing. This is a poem which deals really, really carefully and really in a really fascinating way with sound. So many of Blake's impressions of London relate to the sounds that he can hear. So it's quite a sensory depiction of his journey through the city. So in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear. So we have the juxtaposition here of man with infant. So this suffering affects everyone at every stage of life. From infancy to adulthood. Okay, and we have these words that illustrate pain as well. A cry of pain, perhaps, and then we have this word fear. And look again at this use of repetition, creating that sense of rigidity, inflexibility, lack of freedom. It's as though Blake has only allowed himself a certain amount of words to convey these ideas, and he uses them repetitively to emphasise the grinding nature of life in this city, where poverty is rife. And there is this huge difference, this huge disparity between the power that is afforded to those at the top of society and then compared to those who live in suffering and pain and drudgery at the bottom end of society. And it's those people that Blake empathises with and that he decides to focus on within this poem. So in every voice, in every ban, and there again is that word with its connotations of restriction and limitation. He hears the mind-forged manacles. Now, manacles are like shackles. They're restraints that would be put on the wrists of a prisoner or the ankles of a prisoner, these manacles that restrict their movement. But what Blake does here within this incredibly powerful metaphor is that he suggests that these manacles aren't physical. These aren't people who are being physically restricted and restrained. These manacles have been made in the mind. So let's break that down a little bit. It's a metaphor suggesting lack of freedom is not a physical experience, but a mental and an emotional one. So these restrictions he sees as being something that affects someone through every aspect of their life. It's even in the way that they think. The word forged, I think, is a really interesting. The mind forged is a compound adjective, two words joined together there by a hyphen, that describe these manacles. And forged has these connotations of industry. And it's here, I think, that we see, and a nice AO3 connection here, might be that this idea of something being forged links to Blake's suspicion and rejection of the Industrial Revolution. He rejects these ideas of industry as being a positive thing for humanity. He felt that actually these factories that he saw sprouting up all over the country were separating people from what it truly meant to be human and leading them further away from their natural impulses. So forged has connotations of industry, and that has that AO3 connection to context in Blake's life. But it also has these suggestions of a forge, a place of heat and power and compression and oppression, suggesting that the creation of these manacles is almost a painful experience in itself and a powerful one. But these manacles are forged in the mind, and this is where I think Blake's message comes through really most powerfully. He sees people as being primarily imprisoned by constraints of their own making. They do not believe that they are free, and therefore they are not. These manacles are manacles that they have put on themselves, and they begin and they are grown and they are forged in the mind. So, his metaphor then, suggesting that the lack of freedom isn't a physical experience but a mental and emotional one, and that the limitations people put on themselves are of their own creation. Okay, so let's remember that AO3 link. Blake rejected the Industrial Revolution. I'm just going to abbreviate that as IR. Okay, so on to stanza 3 then. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So again, we have the repetition of the word cry. Again, we have the sense of this oral experience, listening to the sounds of London. Again, Blake is focused on sound and the different sounds of suffering and sounds of misery that he can hear. The cry of the chimney sweeper and the sigh of the unfortunate soldier. So let's look at this first two lines together. The chimney sweeper's cry. Now, one of the things that you need to know about Blake is that he was passionately interested in interested in protecting the innocence of children. He was particularly upset and devastated by the suffering of innocent children that he could see in the city that he lived in. And chimney sweepers were young children, often children who had been born into poverty or whose parents had died, children who didn't have other opportunities. So the chimney sweeper's cry, you might want to make that AO3 link, that Blake cared deeply about the suffering of children. And when he references the chimney sweeper, he also references the church. And this is a real criticism of organised religion and of the church's abuse of its power that Blake recognised in his time. And I'm just going to make some little AO3 notes about this down here. Every blackening church appalls. So your AO3 link, Blake uses this line to criticise the church's abuse of its power. So, a couple of things here. First of all, Blake was a religious man, but his religious views were in conflict much of the time with the views of the church and established organised religion. Blake really struggled to reconcile his own religious convictions and religious beliefs with what he saw as the repressive and restrictive views and attitudes of the church. So he was quite critical of organised religion in his time, and this in itself was quite a scandalous viewpoint to take in a society where the church was one of the major and most dominant powers. But he uses this line to critique the church because often it was the church who would take in orphaned children, ostensibly to protect them, in theory to look after them and give them somewhere safe to live, but in reality often putting them to work as chimney sweeps, a job which carried with it the incredibly high probability of contracting disease, which carried with it an enormous amount of dangers to both health and life. So the church was taking these children in theory to protect them, but actually in reality was putting them into more dangerous situations. And particularly this upset and offended Blake because the church stood to gain financially from this arrangement. The church would make money off the work done by these children. And he sees this as absolute moral corruption. The church as an organisation, as a powerful force within the society that he lived, was abusing its power, and it was affecting and leading to the suffering of children. So this is the connection. The church put orphan children in its care to work as sweeps, leading to their sickness and suffering. And Blake uses this stanza, uses these lines to attack the church's hypocrisy. The church setting out to protect children, going and putting them into more danger. So knowing what we know there, looking at those AO3 notes, let's just look at those lines again. And let's look at the fact that he refers to the church with the adjective blackening. And this blackening carries a dual meaning. Blackening has connotations of the soot that would have covered the chimney sweepers. It's this language of soot and dirt and ash. And it's used almost to stain, to tarnish the church. The church which has associations of whiteness and lightness and purity, is stained and is shamed by this blackening soot of the chimney sweepers, because this is their shame, this is their corruption, this is their abuse of power. So these two lines then illustrate the corruption of the church, the corruption of power, the suffering of innocent children, and this word blackening, it connotes corruption, and it brings to mind the image of soot, as if the sweeps themselves have stained the church. Blake shames them. So he uses this word appalls, and that reflects this sense of shame and anger that he feels directed towards the church as an institution. Okay, so these next two stanzas then are again used to critique a powerful force within London, but this time he is critiquing the monarchy. And he uses these lines: "The hapless soldier's sigh." Hapless means unfortunate. So this is a soldier who has potentially died at war, died fighting for their country. Sigh has more of a sense of melancholy about it. I think it's less a scream or a wail of pain. It has more of a sense of regret, of despair. It has more of a sense of sadness to it. And the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So again, Blake uses a metaphor here to convey this idea, the idea that the sigh can transform and run in blood. And he uses that blood much as he uses this word blackening. It's as though the blood of the soldier stains the walls of the palace. So again, it's that image of a stain, and it's that mark of shame, this time not on the church's walls, but on those of the palace. So it's a stain, and it shames those authorities. This is a bold poem, and it's one which openly states Blake's anger and frustration at abuse of power that he sees all around him. And he sees how it affects everyone. We must remember that. This poem deals with the universal nature of suffering within the city. Let's just look at how many people he's spoken about so far. We have the repetition at the start of these lines, this use of anaphora, suggesting that the cries of every man, in every infant's voice, in every voice he hears. And then he's focused on two other examples, the cry of the chimney sweepers and now the sigh of the soldiers. He's critiqued the church, he's critiquing the palace, critiquing the monarchy. And now we're going to come to, in the final stanza, in the final quatrain, the greatest source of Blake's despair. But most through midnight streets I hear. So again, it's this oral experience, this sound journey through London that he's experiencing. And we get the impression that he's walked endlessly through the city. We've now arrived at the midnight streets, and this is something that stands out to him the most. So, the thing that he hears most frequently is the curse of the youthful harlot. So, a youthful harlot is a young prostitute, and the curse suggests that this is perhaps, well, there are multiple interpretations of this line. We might look at it, a curse as in their cursing, their foul language, their shouts of pain and of suffering and of despair and misery. But we might also look upon this as the idea that they are themselves cursed. He hears in these women's voices the curse that is their lives, the curse that is their pain and suffering. So, we've moved towards the midnight streets. And youthful harlots again reminds us that Blake was fascinated and cared deeply about the suffering of the young. Here, he focuses his attention on young prostitutes in the city of London. At the time that Blake was writing this poem, prostitution was absolutely rife within the country's capital. So it was something that was very much an open, problematic issue within the city. So this would have been something he would have heard a lot. So we're looking at the youthful harlot's curse. That word curse suggesting their language, the way that they speak, with aggression, with pain, with anger. But it's a word that also has connotations of inescapable suffering, as though they are themselves cursed. And then we have this powerful verb. This curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. And again, we come back to that idea of Blake's passionate interest in and real depth of pain when he saw the suffering of those who were young. So he looks at the children of these young harlots, these youthful harlots, these young prostitutes, and he sees how their suffering is caused by their mother's suffering. So the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. This could perhaps reflect listening to these women shouting at their young, or it could reflect their children hearing the shouts and the pain and the anger and the frustration of their mothers. But we have the connection of the youthful harlot's curse with the tear of the infant. And this creates the sense of a cycle of misery, a cycle of suffering, and a cycle of oppression. So the verb blasts conveys violence and pain. The newborn infant's tear reflects the suffering of the young, the suffering of children. And when we look at this line, taken together with the previous line, the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, Blake uses these lines to create the impression that this is an inescapable cycle of suffering. And it is perhaps this sense that this is an inescapable and continuing pattern that distresses Blake the most. When he says most through midnight streets I hear, we get the impression that this is the thing that distresses and upsets him more than any other. And it's perhaps this idea that this is misery that's being handed on from generation to generation of disenfranchised people who've been rejected and let down by the systems of authority in the city that they live. And there is no end to their suffering. This final line is one that's spoken about often when this poem is being discussed, and it connects this idea that Blake has just discussed, this cycle of suffering. It links that with the sense that this is a suffering that spreads through the city. And in order to communicate that idea of a spreading suffering, Blake employs this metaphorical language related to sickness. He writes that this blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So the youthful harlot's curse causes plagues. Now, this language of sickness is widely recognised to be reflective of sexually transmitted disease, and it suggests that these women live lives not only of emotional suffering but physical suffering as well. They are sick and they are ill. So the youthful harlot's curse blights with plagues. So the metaphor suggests that the youthful harlots cause the spread of disease. And in this final line, Blake uses this really jarring juxtaposition in an imagined vehicle, the marriage hearse. We might imagine a carriage carrying a newlywed couple, but Blake imagines a curse, a vehicle used to carry a coffin. So we have the juxtaposition of the word marriage with all of its connotations of joy and happiness and love, with the word hearse, which literally means a vehicle for carrying a coffin. And when we take these two words together, we understand that this is a marriage which has brought together two people, and they are united by these plagues. The plagues have affected the marriage hearse. The couple carried together are linked by disease. In plain language, we might infer here that Blake is suggesting that married men who sleep with prostitutes pass on the plagues that they catch to their new wives, and that this causes a spread of sickness throughout the city. So, marriage hearse, when we take these words together, this is a metaphor for the sickness of sexually transmitted diseases. So why does Blake choose to end this poem on such a repulsive, disturbing image? Well, in my view, it's the idea that this sickness is reflective not of a physical sickness necessarily, but that it represents a greater sense of moral sickness. Blake looks at the city and he sees misery and suffering and despair everywhere. He sees the marks of weakness and the marks of woe in the faces of the people that he meets. He hears their cries of pain. He hears their curses. He hears their sighs and their woes and their miseries. And when he looks at the prostitute who is ill and spreading disease, he sees that as symptomatic of the moral sickness that spreads throughout this society, which, rather than being based on universal values of love and joy and freedom, the kind of values that Blake as a romantic poet held most dear, he sees a society that is built on greed when he looks at the church making money from the chimney sweepers. He sees a society that is marked by violence when we look at the hapless soldier's sigh. And he sees a society that is defined by its restriction, its repressive authority that holds down the people that live there, and that capitalises and profits on their pain and suffering. Now, when we're looking at those ideas of oppression, it's really important to remember as well that when the French Revolution, which had happened just a few years prior, was first beginning, Blake was really passionately inspired by its values of freedom, equality and brotherhood, embodied in the slogan Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. He was fascinated by these ideals, and he saw in the French Revolution the possibility of a society that was based on a greater sense of equality amongst all of its people. He was deeply, deeply pained to see the bloody escalation that revolution took. But in this poem, we might argue that Blake is longing for a similar liberation of the people in the city that he lives, longing for them to throw off their mind-forged manacles and live lives of freedom. This is what he may hope for. All right, I hope that was a useful video for you. This is a poem which hasn't yet come up within the collection, and it's one of the most powerful evocations of ideas about power and its abuse within the power and conflict collection. So it would be a really brilliant one to analyse in an exam situation. All right, I hope that's been useful. Good luck everybody with your revision, and I will see you again very soon.